In our last lecture, we looked at marginalized groups. In this lecture, we turn our attention to civil society and evolving modes of citizen participation. To understand civil society in the context of China, it's worthwhile going back to first principles and definitions. There is a general agreement that civil society is a space between state and family. Beyond this, it becomes a bit murky insofar that civil society theory is quite Western-based, whereby the idea of civil society is where it is distinctively different than the state and it's largely autonomous of the state. Civil society lies beyond the boundaries of the family, the clan, and beyond the locality. In other words, it lies short of the state. The autonomy from the state is an aspect of civil society theory that's been constantly re-emphasized in Western political thought, as this is seen as a crucial element for non-democratic nations in the process of political transition. Whether it is salt merchant guild, or environmental groups, or migrant organized associations, these social organizations form the sphere of civil society. How is civil society different in China? What emerged in the late 1980s and 1990s is the question of whether civil society exists in nations such as China, because of the presence of the state in all aspects of Chinese society. Again, the origins of the concept of civil society is based on purely Western political thought, and has led many to be cautious in applying the term to China. It is the emphasis on political change through the separation of state and society that have many treading cautiously in this area. There are, however, two ways in which we can use civil society and the concept of civil society in China. It can be used as a concept to understand social change, particularly in an era where there's greater pluralization of social groups. Put differently, it can be used as a heuristic device, using the experiences of the lives of social groups to guide our understanding, rather than the civil society framework in itself. Another way to think about civil society in the context of China is to acknowledge that it does exist in some form, and to move towards an understanding of the elements of civil society, their work and agendas. The final question we need to ask ourselves is, why is civil society a topic of discussion and research in relation to China? Since the early 1990s, scholars and observers concerned with China have deployed the concept of civil society to explain the pluralization of Chinese society, indicated by the growing number of NGOs. While there seems to be genuine social change in terms of state-society relationships in China, and an increasing number of NGOs dedicated to various social concerns, the concept of civil society should be used with caution. It should be used with caution since it is inherently a Western political idea. Nonetheless, the interest in using civil society as a framework can partially explain civil unrest and civil associational life in the context of China. Another way to understand civic associational life and interactions is to look at it through the prism of the public sphere. The public sphere, in the Habermasian sense, has been utilized to express and examine social change. For Jürgen Habermas, the public sphere is a space between civil society and the state. It allows matters of general interest to be discussed. This approach would appear to be less politicized, as it does not suggest such a deterministic view as does the civil society framework. In other words, the civil society framework leads to political systemic change, whereas the public sphere sort of conception is trying to understand how these social changes interact. Now, where does this idea of political system change come from? Well, we see that from the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s has been attributed largely to civil society organizations in countries such as Poland and Hungary. The idea of the public sphere has been less politicized in the context of China. In fact, assessing the possibility of a public sphere in the late Qing period, we can suggest that there has been a continuing expansion of the public realm since 1900. This has not, however, led to the habituated assertion of civic power against the state. But is the goal of understanding either civil society or the public sphere in the context of China, a transformative one? Is it one in which we need to understand it within political lens whereby there might be massive political change within the context of China? To understand such a large question in the context of China, we need to remind ourselves of the role of the state. That is, when it comes to the state and civil society, the Chinese state is intimately involved in the development and regulation of civil society, and thus social transformation, political transformation, and economic transformation that may involve civil society actors will still have ultimately the state playing a role. As we have seen within the civil society theory, there must be a separation between state and society, as civil society in the Western conception means a watchdog or monitoring the actions of the state. However, in nations such as China, this is not the case. The state is intimately involved in civil society and the organizations within it. The fear of instability or the threat to the state or the party's legitimacy is carefully monitored, as we've talked about in earlier lectures. In understanding civil society in China, it is essentially an understanding of state-society relationships. It would seem that the involvement and the role of the local state adds a different dimension to state-society relationships, leading to various types of relationships depending on the social organization in question and the level of state involved. For instance, with the close relationship between state and society, the organizations become almost embedded within the state. Thus, through the passage of time, they obtain their legitimacy because they are intimately connected with the state. With the state so intimately involved in civil society, it has created doubts among analysts to the existence of civil society. Is this the case that there may be no civil society in China? Could there be no other ways to conceive or understand the Chinese context? Is there an analytical problem? The Chinese state dominance creates doubt about the possibility of self-society. The state is seen as an enabling factor for the work of NGOs. For many, this reliance is seen as a step back from the creation of an independent and autonomous self-society for two reasons. First, the autonomy and independence of these organizations are eroded when they rely upon government finances and favors. Second, there's the fear that these organizations may become handmaidens of the state, or the possibility of becoming no more than an aid to the public sector. Here we see a larger body of literature emerging to question the existence or search for civil society. But again, are we seeking to find an exact replica of what we've seen in Western societies? A civil society that is relatively autonomous, a critical realm of the state? This might be a misguided approach to understanding the elements of civil society in the context of China. Another way to conceive civil society and non-state actors' involvement in civic life is looking at the role and understanding how social organizations in China operationalize. First, what is the role of social organizations? The provision of social welfare is seen as an important function for China's NGOs. Even the salt merchant guilds of the late Qing Empire became ever more important for the delivery of social welfare. What challenges or difficulties are social organizations faced with? Well, foremost, the involvement of the state in regulations pertaining to NGOs can be seen as an obstacle to the development of NGOs. Mind you, some organizations have the benefit of state support. For example, those involved in the migrant children's education or migrant legal advocacy have greater room and freedom to conduct their work. While these organizations are working within the parameters of the state, they are working in areas that the government has highlighted as important and thus are allowed sometimes greater leeway and even the possibility to influence policy-making process. However, those working on the delivery of basic social services at the community level have some opportunity to engage with the state. Although there certainly needs to be diversity of the organization, the privileging of certain issues will lead to the marginalization of other issues. Finally, can we ask whether or not social organizations are potential agents of socio-political change, as civil society theorists have long hoped for? Well, these NGOs and social organizations are undertaking important social tasks. The expectation that they may become agents of political change is wrongly placed, as we've talked about throughout this lecture. Most NGOs are not seeking to become a civic power against the state. Rather, they desire to complement state activities. Nevertheless, we need to acknowledge that there is indeed an emergence or perhaps a re-emergence of a sector that addresses a range of social concern. Whether we call it a civil society or a public sphere is missing the point and the realities on the ground. The idea that there is a vibrant social sector is not completely foreign, nor is the idea of the involvement of the state. Very briefly, let me retrace the historical roots of what scholars see as the tradition of an active social sector. The first relates to the relaxation of central control. The management of local affairs in China is becoming less of a burdensome obligation, but actually an area where elites could show their concern and support for the local community and simultaneously demonstrate their wealth and status. Second, the oversupply of trained scholars exceeded the number of bureaucrat posts available. Subsequently, educated individuals had to redefine occupations that were respectable while creating greater segmentation of society based on status. Third, there's a gentry merchant elite that surfaced as a result of the social and economic resources becoming more plentiful. In the context of China, we can see this historically. Although the state and bureaucracy of the Ming and Qing dynasties were effective and dominant, it did, however, leave room for public activity to flourish where the state could not afford to be present, notably in areas such as famine relief or natural disasters. Thus, local elites were able to create a public sphere where administrative activities could take place in times of need, and in turn, a forum for public discussion germinated. These public initiatives undertaken by the local elites did not challenge the state, therefore they were able to flourish. And it is precisely this, in the contemporary context of China, when the state does not feel threatened by the flourishment of a civil society sector, this is when civil society actors have greater leeway. As we have discussed, civil society is often employed to understand socio-political change. Whether this is the approach we adopt, it is nonetheless a device to illuminate greater pluralization of society. If state and society are not so easily separable, what might this mean for socio-political change in China? Social stakeholders may not be the agents of change as we might expect them to be due to their close interrelatedness of states and society. Might this mean that change will occur from within the state itself? In the end, there is no single theoretical framework that will adequately explain the social, political, and economic changes that are occurring. What we must remember is that certain frameworks highlight a particular aspect of change and does not necessarily provide the full picture. The Chinese sort of case is a great example of this. The growth of social organizations in contemporary society can in part be explained by the civil society approach. Nonetheless, there are challenges in terms of definition and applicability of a Western conception to nations such as China, and the problems associated with the state controlling the development of NGOs, whether explicitly or implicitly. In using such frameworks to assess social change, we must possess an awareness of the situation that we are studying and be ready to accept that the application of a particular framework or method may not lead to the societal outcomes that had been desired. As a result, it may not necessarily be the case that civil society in the Western sense, that is, in terms of a strict separation between state and society, may actually occur in China. Nevertheless, in the Chinese context, it may possess characteristics which can be similar or a hybrid of the Western idea of civil society. The centrality of the state requires us to account for the state when it comes to civil society theory as applied to the Chinese case. This concludes our lecture on civil society and evolving modes of citizen participation. In the following lectures, we'll look at the internationalization of China and its effects. We'll also turn our attention to the foreign relations of China.